So let us then begin. My name is Susan Douglas. I'm the K-14 Education Outreach Director at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And we're very happy to have the panel being able to reprise, which took place in Denver in just early December of last year, 2022, on teaching about the Middle East in standards in the classroom, in literature, and various other areas. This panel was originally a sponsored panel, and so it's a real honor to have been able to do something that involved education at an academic conference. That is slightly rare. There's a lot going on in revision of standards now and across the country, and we've actually got 3 of them on the table in my little world of DC, Maryland, and Virginia. So it's an important panel, and I'd like to introduce panel member, Kristen Tassin. I've just put the link to the bios, and somebody can repeat it because it only is valid for people who are actually in the meeting. So I just put it down. I'm going to start just by introducing my colleague, Kristen Tassin, who will take over. And I'm seeing her bio's not on here. Oh gosh, it was just carried up from. Okay, so Kristen, I'm sorry if you could introduce yourself. I thought it was on the abstract from our MESA description.
Absolutely, no problem. And I'm going to apologize also because we have bad weather here. So if my Zoom screen goes a little wonky, it's because Zoom has a real issue with the wind, apparently. So hopefully it goes back after a few seconds. My name is Kristen Tassin. I teach high school at Benjamin Franklin in New Orleans. My academic background is in history. I got my PhD in history with a focus on modern Egypt from University of Texas at Austin. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to be talking today about teaching a Middle Eastern history elective in the high school classroom. So I will go ahead and share my screen, hopefully. Okay. So I started teaching my Middle Eastern study elective about 6 years ago. I've taught it now in a couple of different settings, a small private school setting and also a large public school setting. So I've been able to play around with it a little bit. It is an elective, which also allows me a lot more leeway in terms of standards and what I want to do than teaching a core class and the curriculum that goes along with that would. But I've tweaked it over the years. So this is just some of the things I've learned in doing that and sort of in refining the curriculum. So before each class, so before this is a year-long class. Before the class starts, I always ask students sort of why they wanted to take the class, what their main interests were. By and large, the main interest is always women, women's studies, women in Islam, women in the Middle East. I would say there's probably a 2-to-1 margin of female students versus male students in these classes. Second to that would be an interest in Islam historically, but also just information about the religion more generally. Followed by interest in the Arab Spring, interest in post-World War II, post-colonialism, Arab nationalism, and then a slight interest in kind of terrorism generally, modern wars and invasions in the Middle East kind of in general. But women definitely is every year the most, the topic that students are most interested in. I always ask students why they were interested and what topics they're most interested in, because it's important to me, and I think it's important in general in an elective, but especially in this kind of elective, to try to steer the course as much as possible to what students are interested in, especially where you can in terms of primary documents, in terms of projects, in terms of supplementary materials. The more you can get them to want to dive into the material, the more they're going to give to the course, and then the more they're going to get out of the course. So knowledge base. As you can tell from the question marks, they don't usually come with a lot of it. So this class is 10th through 12th graders, always. Usually they're coming in either have taken or in the middle of taking world history or European history. So they might know a little bit in the context of those two classes, which means they might know something to do with colonization, with the Middle East being colonized. They might have an idea of the tail end of the Ottoman Empire with the kind of sick man of Europe theme. They might know something about Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal empires as the gunpowder empires in the comparative world history framework. If you're lucky, they might know something about the mandate system and North African colonization, and that's about it. So one of the challenging parts of teaching this class is that, so I've taught US history, world history, European history, and those students come in to those classes not necessarily with a super solid base of information. They've usually heard in passing at least some of the terms, especially US history. They have some kind of familiarity with the vocab, whether they know what it means or not. For Middle Eastern history course, they don't know really anything. They don't have a passing familiarity with most of it at all. Or if they do, they've heard it in a completely different context, which doesn't make sense to the context they're going to hear it in this class. So there is a lot of focus on just trying to get the basics down, the geography, just the base history is really important for them when this class starts. So what works and what doesn't in this class? There's been a lot of trial and a whole lot of error in trying to put this class together. The things that I've found that have not worked, first of all, lectures. I'm sure people who teach high school generally know lectures don't work in a lot of different ways. But for this class in particular, and probably for electives more than other classes, lectures are difficult, but they're difficult for this class because it is hard for the students to keep up with the terminology. It's hard for them to keep up with who and what you're talking about, even if you have it, sort of literally spelled out or diagrammed out. It's hard for them to keep things in context. It's hard for them to follow a narrative when they're just listening to it. They're much better with the subject material when it's more tangible, when it's smaller, in smaller chunks. Textbooks are very difficult. The Middle Eastern history textbooks are written for university students. They are too dense. For high school students, they're too difficult to try to assign for homework. They have too many questions about reading it. The kind of world studies textbooks that are written for high school students don't have enough really information that's useful to try to give them. So there's a lot of supplementary texts instead, or primary documents that I use that are more helpful. The kind of odd thing that I've discovered that sort of doesn't make any sense, but seems to be what happens in these area studies electives, and I'll sort of talk about it on the flip side of what does work, is too much content and too wide of a scope. Trying to teach a very general area studies class doesn't work. And I've spoken to colleagues who teach other area studies class electives, Excuse me, and they found much the same thing, that if you try to teach a kind of true survey class to these high schoolers, it's just too much content for them. To try to teach a full sort of scope and sequence of Middle Eastern history it's just too much, because they don't have the base of information for it. And to try to get through everything, which I would love to do, but it's just too much. So what does work? Most important thing, timelines. I have a giant timeline going all the way around my room that they're doing. So they get confused, especially when you've got multiple caliphates or empires happening at the same time in different places, multiple names that sound the same or are the same. So for them to be able to look at it all the time and see what's happening in different places at the same time, different times, one thing that follows from another is very helpful for them. Something that is narrow in scope and focus, centered around case studies. They really do so much better the smaller the content, which doesn't make sense because you would think they need the general content before they can get to the specific content, but honestly, they do massively better if they get the specific content first, and then they can extrapolate out to the more general content. So the more tangible, the more specific the information they get, the better they are at it, because they can remember specifics about people or a family or a war or specific items that are traded or a specific city in a specific time period. And those things make sense to them. And then they can then generalize out from there to larger ideas, and they can make connections. So the more tangible the thing is, the more it makes sense in a sort of narrative structure, the better they are able to deal with it, and then they can extrapolate it out. Languages. If you know and can teach them any Arabic, Turkish, Persian, they are yours for life. They are so excited. And again, following student interest. So anytime you have independent projects, research projects that you can give them to do where they're able to follow their own interests, see what works for them, what sort of stuff they really want to find out more about, generally the more invested they will be. So I'm a big fan of primary documents and monographs. Primary documents, history teachers love, of course, and I know Susan's going to talk more about some fantastic places you can get primary documents. But I'm also a big fan of having them read monographs. So again, monographs over textbooks. It takes a long time. It takes them a long time to read it. It takes us a long time to go through it and discuss it. But they really do enjoy it and they get into it. We have had great discussions about monographs. I've had them read things like Kennedy's When Baghdad Ruled the Muslim World, Casali's Ottoman Age of Exploration. They find these things really interesting, and they really grasp onto these sort of small details that then help them better understand the larger issues. Other thing I absolutely love, film and literature. So I have them read at least one work of fiction. So I've done Aleph the Unseen for Arab Spring. I've done any of Jason Goodwin's Inspector Yashim series, or any of the other, there's several mystery series set in the Ottoman Empire. Cairo trilogy, or any of Mahfouz for 19th and 20th century Egypt. Of course, you can't leave out Ertugrul for Rise of the Ottoman Empire and discussions of Turkish nationalism. I've had them watch the Syrian Harun al-Rashid series. We probably had the best debate or discussion I have seen in my classroom over the appropriate role of women in court politics, debating Harun al-Rashid Harun al-Rashid's wife Zubaida's role at the court, having them watch this series, than we have over anything else I've ever had them work with. I think they feel much more comfortable grasping themes, looking at historic details, critiquing fictionalized versions of characters or fictional characters in the case of the books, than they do critiquing historic figures in primary documents or in works of history. And they feel more comfortable critiquing films and books than they do critiquing historical literature. So this gives them an entree into the history that they feel a lot more comfortable with. And they don't mind having a raucous debate about Zubaida, the character on this musalsal, which actually gets them into a big discussion about court politics that they kind of backed into without realizing it, but was actually really interesting. So in conclusion, my advice for this kind of class is be as flexible as possible, have fun with them. They really do get excited about these kind of classes. And, you know, if they leave having learned anything, that's a lot more than they came in with. And the more they're able to enjoy these sorts of electives, the more likely they will be to go ahead and take another one of these classes in the future. So, thank you.
Yes, to say thank you, Kristen. You've just received a great treat because Kristen didn't have the opportunity to present in Denver. So we have now gotten the full treatment of what she has done. A very useful presentation. I'm in the process of creating a resource folder where we can put the PowerPoints, and I will put that link in the chat in just a moment. But first, I want to move our panel along and introduce Matthew McLean. His presentation will focus on the need to make better Middle East related curricula available to high school teachers.
Thank you, Susan, for organizing this again. And let's hope that my screen shares. Oh boy, Zoom has updated, and we may not get a PowerPoint, but this is very strange.
You should be able to share your
yeah, it's the problem, I think, is on my end, not yours.
Okay, if you want to, we can move on to the next one, and we can you can send me your PowerPoint by email and I will put it up and run it.
That might be a good idea. Sorry for the.
Okay, then how about if we go to I think Nora?
I'm sure, I'm happy to go.
And she already shared hers, so we know that she can do it.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be with you. I'm not a teacher, but I worship teachers and librarians. So it's a great honor to be here. You'll know I'm not a teacher when I give my presentation because I have too much content and you're not supposed to do that. But why am I here today? It's because of a couple of reasons. I'm an author, so this young adult book, Ida in the Middle, just came out in November. And in the run-up to the publication, I was very interested in having this book and the subject of Palestine taught in schools. I'm not Palestinian myself, but I'm the mother of 3 Palestinian daughters, one of whom had quite a negative experience in US schools. So as I reached out to teachers all across the country to learn about what they know, what they want to know, do they teach Palestine, why do they, or why don't they? I heard a lot of reasons why teachers don't teach about Palestine. I tried to address many of them on the book's website under teaching resources, and you'll find a lot of stuff there, but there were gaps. One of the gaps that I want to talk about today is that teachers didn't always know how to choose materials well. I think I can say that there aren't enough materials to help teachers teach about Palestine. There just aren't enough. But The ones that are out there, if you can find them, how do you know if they're any good? How do you know if my book is any good? So I started a research project with 4 Palestinian teachers to see if we could develop a framework that would help teachers and librarians and parents and students to evaluate books involving Palestine and make good choices. And that's the presentation that I want to share with you. This presentation, let's see. How's that look? Okay. Yes, no?
Yes, we can see it.
Good. So these are the Palestinian teachers that I'm working with from all across the country on a framework. And where did we get the idea of a framework? We looked at, no, I don't, oh good, okay, I can. We looked at a whole bunch of other frameworks that exist, social justice frameworks and frameworks for different groups. And one that really touched me is the one in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, Reading and Teaching with Diverse Nonfiction Children's Books. And in there is one of my heroes, Debbie Reese, who you may all know, helps us to better understand the nuances of books involving Indigenous people for children. And so we set out to do something like this, something where we could help folks who are interested to understand the nuances that are sometimes hard to see in children's literature. So we started by getting a long list of books, and we got this in a million ways through the awards, through Amazon, through BookScan, through library searches, and through word of mouth. And originally we had 123 books. We now have more, but this analysis is on those first 123 books. It's interesting that of them, 67% were about Palestine and 21% about Israel. And then there were other books that were about something else, like migration, but that Palestine or Palestinians were represented in them. A few other statistics about that population from which we chose. Less than 70% of the books about Palestine were by Palestinians. Interesting. And only 21% were translated. That's also interesting because it means that most of the books available to kids today are books like mine that were written in English and may be a different representation, not bad, but a different representation than the kind of books that Palestinian kids read in Arabic. So it's important to note that. And then of the books in English by Palestinians, 40% of them in that target population were self-published. That actually led to a whole other research project, which I wrote about in School Library Journal on Betsy Bird's blog, showing that the censorship of Palestinian children's books begins way before, before they get published, and they often don't get published. And then when they do get published, they often don't get reviewed, et cetera, et cetera. So these are important things for us to know because it helps us to understand the importance of reaching out and making that extra effort to find books that show Palestine and Palestinians, not only for the benefit of the Palestinian kids and Palestinian teachers who are in the schools and have that right and the need to see themselves reflected in books, the mirrors, but also the windows for the non-Palestinian kids to learn about people who are different in some way and very similar in many ways, and people who they may get information about through the media that isn't fully accurate. So it helps them develop more of a critical point of view. And then the last thing I want to say is that books about Israel which are included, of course, in the sample, because when we're talking about books that involve Palestine, books involving Israel also involve Palestine, because we're talking about the same place, just with different names. So the books about Israel were 2 times more likely to be nonfiction than the books about Palestine. In fact, there were very few nonfiction books about Palestine, and fewer of them, maybe not even one, were written by Palestinians. And that's really also important to realize the people who are authorizing them to speak about what's true are often non-Palestinians. And that's another reason why self-representation turns out to be so important when we're looking at books. So we reviewed and analyzed 42 of those 123. We've gone beyond that, and we're continuing this study, but this initial information is based on the 42 books. And from those 42 books, we concluded it's all about erasure. But different kinds of erasure, different nuances, different tactics of erasure. And this is where I think I learned a lot, and I hope the rest of the presentation can just raise everyone's awareness about how this can happen, and we don't even really see it happening. It's very subtle and yet very harmful. So these nuances of erasure fall into 4 categories. Number 1, omission. Second, dehumanization, disinformation and deception. And 4th, distortion, decontextualization, and depoliticization. And what I want to do is way too quickly walk you through examples of them, not so that you'll remember all of the information, but that you'll walk away going, wow, I need to learn more, or I want to learn more. I'm interested in learning more. So we start with omission, literally not mentioning or showing Palestinians. This is a book about Itzhak Perlman, a very important subject and not a bad book as books go, except that when Itzhak is in Israel, there is no Palestinian visible, although Palestinians are 20% of the population of Israel. And I don't think it's an oversight, or at least it's not wholly an oversight, because when Itzhak comes to the United States, this book very intentionally portrays the United States as a country of diversity. You see Black people, white people, you know, different shapes, different ages, which is not true when they're portraying Israel. We also have part of omission not representing Palestinian areas as Palestinian. So here you have Via della Rosa, which is a Christian part of the old city that is a Palestinian neighborhood. And yet in this picture, there's no Palestinians. It's all foreign tourists, a kind of omission. We have selectively excluding Palestinian history. And this is just one example, growing up below sea level, but many books, many books, not just the ones about Israel, but the nonfiction books that are about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they'll generally mention 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel. They'll often go to 1967 when the West Bank was occupied, and then they'll go to 1973, and then maybe they'll go to 1987 Intifada sometimes, or they'll just go straight to Oslo. But what they're leaving out is pretty much all of the conflicts or wars that are agreed upon to be the ones that Israel aggressed. So they leave out 1956, they leave out 1982 Lebanon, they leave out 2006, they leave out Gaza completely, the siege on Gaza for the last 15 years, and other Israeli aggressions. So that's a kind of selective exclusion that is an omission, but it's also obviously a distortion. This is one of my favorites. If you could say something bad as a favorite. I also wrote a whole article about this book, which is Welcome to Israel with Sesame Street. Sesame Street, for me as a mom at least, is kind of a stamp of approval. I think of Sesame Street as an educational organization. And so that branding matters to me. And yet, Sesame Street makes a point of showing Palestinian children, for example, in the middle panel, where it says Jerusalem, we're not wearing my glasses, but it says something like Jerusalem is a city of many religions. And you see there the Palestinian girls, some of whom are definitely Muslim because they're wearing hijab, but Palestinians not mentioned. And they're not mentioned on the third panel either, where the character talks about speaking Arabic and that his friend Israeli speaks Hebrew. And so in this book and many, Palestinians are represented only as religious, cultural, or linguistic minorities of Israel and not as a national group in their own right. But it'd be easy to overlook that. There's blatant racism. This is a Lee and Loeb book, so that's particularly egregious for me because we know they're a highly respected and important diversity publisher. This is an old book, but they really should take it out of print. In this book, they do talk about both the Palestinian child and the Israeli child being affected by violence around them. But in both cases, the violence is from Palestinians. I think that's, again, subtle, but somehow very blatant. They're attempting to show both sides, and yet they show both sides as victims of Palestinians. And that's, I think, also inaccurate when you're talking about a situation of military occupation. There's cultural appropriation of various degrees and levels. In this book, ABC's, Israel ABC's, B is for Bedouin, which at first is like, yay, they included Bedouin. And in this book, P is for Palestinian, which is also, yay, P is for Palestinian. But when you read the text, it's not really so yay, because the text says that, again, I'm not wearing my glasses, but it says that Bedouins are Arabs that come from Israel's deserts. Israel is a state which was established in 1948, 75 years ago. Bedouins have been there longer than the state of Israel. So they're basically taking a people who have a history and a complex identity and all kinds of important, wonderful things about them in their own right, and kind of reducing them to a group that comes from Israel's deserts. And this is a kind of cultural appropriation. There are others, like culturally appropriating food, etc., that are maybe more easy to see. Exotification, I think, maybe is obvious. There was less of this than I expected in the books. We didn't look at very old books, maybe that's why, but here we have an outdoor market and the text is about the beautiful colors and the beautiful spices, which is all very lovely. But the markets in Jerusalem are places of trade and business, their livelihoods, none of which is represented. In fact, you only really see the foreign tourists here in the markets. And then, sorry to be a bit blunt, but there are some actual lies, I think. You have the word Israel here on 3 different children's books, all of which are nonfiction books. So you have the word Israel, and you have the Dome of the Rock, a very important Palestinian icon. But it's not only that it's a Palestinian icon or a Palestinian location, it's that the Dome of the Rock is in East Jerusalem, and East Jerusalem is not part of Israel by international law. In fact, nobody until Trump recognized East Jerusalem as part of Israel and moved their embassies there until President Trump did, and then a few very right-wing governments followed. But according to international law, the annexation of East Jerusalem by Israel was illegal. So for these publishers to put a location in East Jerusalem, a Palestinian icon, on a book cover next to the word Israel is problematic. I would say it's dishonest. We have tokenism. This is a book that I kind of liked the story of the book, and it had some interesting nods at Palestinians. There were times when the main character would notice, that doesn't seem fair, or something like that. But the reason why I included this as tokenism, although there are maybe better examples of it, is because the main character, the protagonist, appears to be concerned about the lower status of Palestinians in Israel, but that concern does not affect her behavior in any way. She doesn't reflect on the information she gets. and that information doesn't affect her actions or what she learns from the experience as a whole. So I really felt as a reader that the references to Palestinians in this book were tokenistic and not productive. Normalization is a hard one for people who aren't very familiar with Palestine and Israel, because being normal is good. We want things to be normal. And there are kinds of normalization that are positive, but this kind isn't. So what you have, and I'm just going to talk about the book on the far right, Adventure Girl Dabby Diggs, is a book about a young Israeli girl who is mentored by a woman archaeologist and learns to dig and find important archaeological treasures. It's really a lovely story, I think, from a gender point of view. It's science, and it's a girl being mentored by a girl, and it has nice original art. But the ministry that oversees the archaeological work of the state of Israel is one of the ministries, along with Parks and Recreation, that are particularly deeply involved with the confiscation of Palestinian land for Israeli settlers and settlements. And so I think that this book would confuse students and teachers and take them away from a more honest and accurate understanding about the role of the ministry that oversees archaeology. There's some Kombatism. I think that stands for itself, stories that reduced everything to a relationship between one Palestinian and one Israeli and celebrate that friendship, and maybe lead readers to think that there's something inherently difficult about a relationship between a Jewish Israeli and a Palestinian, when I know from my experience that's not at all true. I happen to be a Jewish American, and I'm married to a Palestinian Muslim. And I lived in Palestine for probably 15 years over the last 40 years of being married into the family. I think this kind of Kombatism, and the next book, Wishing Upon the Same Stars, which is written by a friend of mine who's Palestinian, but still I'm gonna critique it and say that this book is solving a problem that doesn't exist. There is a problem in Israel, Palestine, a problem over land, but there's not a problem between individuals. There's no intercultural misunderstanding that needs to be solved through a camp or anything like that. So I'm going to skip over a couple because I think I'm taking too long. And maybe I'll just go back to this one because this is a hard one. The Conflation of Judaism with Zionism. So these two books are ostensibly about Judaism. Judaism is a religion. It's a beautiful religion like all religions, and it's also a problematic religion like all religions. But in these two books, there is a conflation of Judaism with the state of Israel, which is problematic because if Judaism and Israel are the same thing, then criticizing Israel, even its policies, becomes anti-Semitic. And that is, in fact, one of the reasons why teachers are sometimes scared to teach about Palestine, because they fear either saying or doing something that's actually anti-Semitic, or being fearful of being accused falsely of anti-Semitism. And that's something that I'm hoping we can get over by really putting that issue front and center and talking about the problem of conflation of Judaism with Zionism. And then I think I'm probably over time. Yes? Somebody, I can't hear you, Susan. Yes, I'm over
I said maybe wrap up in a minute or two.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just shift gears and say there are some best practices. All of these, the problems and the best practices, are being written up into a tool that we will be disseminating, and hopefully writing a journal article, some blog posts, some presentations, maybe at ALA or teachers conferences. And if you hop on any of my websites, including my main blog, which is noralestamra.com, sign up for my newsletter. I will let you know when this tool is ready. It just needs to be finished and vetted, and then it'll be published. It will include these best practices: self-representation, saying the word Palestine, showing both suffering and strength. This is one of my favorite books of all times, the picture book, Salim's Soccer Ball. And this is 18, which inspires engagement. Another best practice is one of my favorite books also. And it's not only about Palestine, it's about 18-year-old girls, but they are self-representing themselves and encouraging engagement with the issues that they can care about. Books that include historical and political context, incorporating translation into books or into curricula. And then there are a few surprises. I'll just mention a couple. I did not find, or we did not find, as much Islamophobia as we expected. And also, there are some books that politicize in a good way, that help students understand the politics so that they can get over this kind of default belief that there's something genetically or inherently or historically or religiously problematic between Jews and Palestinians, or between Jews and Arabs. And also that most fiction about Palestine has very strong women and is very often, almost always, written by women. And those were interesting findings. We have some more work to do, and so stay tuned. There'll be articles and more research about these things. And when we publish this, we will also publish the references. I encourage everyone to ask questions at the end of this workshop, and also to email me or Instagram me or Facebook me or TikTok me or whatever. Don't TikTok me. I don't answer TikTok. But you know, so we can continue the conversation. I'm trying to be useful to teachers, so I appreciate any feedback I get from teachers about what is useful and what can be more useful. Thank you so much to Susan and to all of you for letting me join this teacher event. It's really an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora. So I'm going to share my screen now, which has Matthew McLean's presentation on it. And then he can go ahead and just tell me when to change the slide. 1 second. So here you are. Should be sharing.
Okay, thank you, Susan, and apologies again for technical problems. My Zoom is telling me I need to update my computer and have a new operating system, which is not the most practical thing at this moment. But anyway, so I teach at Brooklyn Technical High School, one of the specialized public high schools. You have to take an exam to get in here in Brooklyn, New York. My PhD is from NYU in the history of the United Arab Emirates, particularly, and I've also taught Middle Eastern history at Edward R. Murrow High School before I got my PhD. But next slide, please. What I base this presentation on is interviews with my colleagues, and I should say right out, I do not teach world history. In spite of my background, I teach AP United States history, which is a little bit more focused. And as Kristen noted, I mean, students have much more of a base, I think, to work from. But I want to talk about some of the structural constraints on teachers in the context of the AP World History curriculum and how the Middle East is taught. What are teachers exactly teaching, and how much time, especially, do they have on Middle East related issues and Islam related topics, which I think might play into some of the difficulties that Kristen talked about in terms of background knowledge or lack thereof. And then finally, what do teachers want and need in terms of outreach from academics and professors and specialists and so on. So that in mind, okay, yes. So thank you, Susan. So we have, for my fellow teachers, this is not a surprise, but 5 classes per day, 5 days a week. We see all 170 of our students every day, 41 minutes long. And then students are off to AP Physics or AP English or gym or lunch or whatever else. So there is, to get class started, to delve into some kind of hopefully depth in whatever topic it is, and then wind up with a summary that students can actually remember in that short time frame is quite a challenge, no matter what the topic is, especially in an AP course when you're racing to get the curriculum done by an exam in May. Next slide. So just for AP World History, this is, it's a huge course. We have about 1,000 students at Brooklyn Tech, and a 6,000 student school who are taking AP World History. It's a broad, it's a very broad survey of world history since 1200. The Middle East pops up, kind of comes in and out of the curriculum. We see the gunpowder empires, which are referred to as land-based empires now. One of the good things, though, is that there is a very heavy emphasis on primary and secondary sources, and that's one of the main, one of teachers' main difficulties in teaching the Middle East is finding good primary and secondary sources, which I'll get back to more in a minute. Next slide. So these are the topics that the College Board lists that are related to the Middle East and to Islam in the course of a year. So teachers are supposed to cover all of these while also covering everything in European history and Chinese history and Russian history and Sub-Saharan African history and Latin American history, and so on and so forth. So to put it bluntly, teachers, most of whom are non-specialists in the region, don't have much time to fit this in. And who knows if the College Board is going to retain the curriculum it has now. Maybe Ron DeSantis is going to come in and, as he's done with AP African American Studies, and say this is not proper education or something. I don't know. But this is the list of topics. Now, in terms of Nora's presentation, in terms of Israel and Palestine, Israel and Palestine barely gets mentioned in the College Board's curriculum framework. The founding of the state of Israel is mentioned as in kind of a blandly neutral category of new states emerging after World War II, whereas Palestinian nationalism isn't mentioned at all. But broadly speaking, Pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism gets a brief mention as well. So our students can go through this curriculum without much information on the Arab-Israeli conflict at all. Next slide, please. So this is what this means in practice for my colleagues who I interviewed, is that the Middle East gets sort of these bite-sized chunks. The earlier time periods tend to get more, in part because they come earlier in the year when teachers are not rushing to finish everything before the exam. So the Ottoman Empire, which is the subject of so much wonderful contemporary scholarship in the Middle East, that hasn't filtered down to high school classrooms and textbooks yet, unfortunately, really only gets 2 or 3 days max, maybe. The Safavids might get a day, and the Mughals might get a day in comparison to the Ottomans, but usually it's the Ottomans who are seen as the main focus of land-based gunpowder empires, and then the others kind of get compared to them. There's still quite a lot of the sick man of Europe and Ottoman decline, that the Ottoman decline thesis and Bernard Lewis that Middle Eastern studies scholars have been trying to get away from for a few decades now, but it's still, our textbooks are 20 or 30 years behind, and teachers are still trying to figure out ways to get past it. So all of these 20th century topics down at the bottom after World War II might get a day. More likely they'll get 10 minutes. So, apologies to anyone who studies the Iranian Revolution and spends their life studying the Iranian Revolution, but 10 minutes, right? An oil might get a mention as a historian of the Gulf and the Emirates. I mean, to me, that's almost impossible to comprehend, but it's teachers have a lot of constraints. They're rushing to finish the entire curriculum by early May, and so students can take the AP World History exam and hopefully do well on it. But that's where we're at. Next slide, please. So what sources do teachers actually use? And this is teachers want primary and secondary sources. The exam itself focuses on primary and secondary sources. In the Middle East is it's harder to find sources than it is certainly for American history, and also I'd say for European history as well. Part of it is simply an issue of translation. There are fewer people who translate Arabic or Persian or Turkish into English than German or French. So the one source that got mentioned the most by my colleagues was the Fordham source book, which was from the early 2000s and is still, it's not very well maintained anymore, but teachers still use it. Some teachers get sources from other teachers that have passed down through this chain of custody with kind of unknown provenance, and the teachers who said that they relied on this often said, we don't even, by this point, sometimes the origin of the source has been lost, and as we want to be good historians, but we don't even know if the source is really a valid source anymore. Sources from prior AP World History exams, and then popular websites. World history textbooks have relatively little on the Middle East, as Kristen noticed, and teachers, being having to prepare 5 lessons a week, and if we have highly motivated students at our school, if we assign a homework assignment out of 170, 160 are going to turn it in, which means then you have to grade it. So we have very little time to kind of dig through the academic literature and go hunting for new documents and ways to improve instruction and so on. So it really is a challenge, especially trying to, given the limited amount of time that my colleagues have to teach about Middle East and Islam related topics, to improve instruction is even harder than getting it started in the first place. Next slide, please. So that said, what is in the AP World History curriculum isn't all that bad in the way it's presented. So this is a sample short answer question that might appear on the AP World History exam. And so it gives the students a map. They're prompted immediately to recognize which empires they are. They need to know something about they have to have some outside evidence, some outside knowledge from their own studies to be able to answer the questions. So it's not simply regurgitating what's in the source, but relating the source to things that they've studied in class. Next slide. So what teachers want above all is brief texts. A lot of the document readers that are out there in Middle Eastern history are appropriate for undergraduates. They have sources that are 2 or 3 pages long that which make for great discussion, but in this context of a very fast-paced high school classroom don't really work. And teachers who are not specialists in the region often don't feel comfortable cutting down sources and editing them because they worry about missing the most important points. So they prefer the sources come pre-edited, if you will. First-person narratives, as Kristen noted, students really love stories of individual lives that are a springboard to discussing all sorts of other complex and more general topics. but translations, again, are hard to find. And we have wonderful volumes like Struggle and Survival in the Modern Middle East, but those accounts are like 25 pages long each. Short videos of scholars. This is one of my colleagues really likes showing short clips of historians talking about what they do, because it introduces students to historical thinking as well as to the content that they are focusing on. And then it would be nice generally to have an AP World History curriculum reader that teachers from around the country could rely on in the same way that we have document readers for other sources or for other regions of the world, especially for American and European history. Next slide. So one of the reasons why these short bite-sized sources are so in demand is because the most central item on the AP World History exam and on the AP US History exam that I teach towards is the document-based question. The students receive 7 documents. They have to use 6 of them to support their thesis. They can also choose the easier, well, they can choose to use 3 if they want. Now, they have to read them and come up with a thesis and some historical context and all the other stuff on there in 60 minutes. It's not really, I have to say as a historian, it's not really an authentic exercise. Like the goals are laudable. I mean, putting a document in its historical context is what historians do. But historians don't go into the archives and have 7 pre-selected documents that are given to us right there. Nor do we spend most of our time regurgitating the content of the documents itself. Like it's the context of the documents that or our general knowledge that informs our reading of the documents more than anything else, which is a problem from a disciplinary perspective for this particular exercise. But nevertheless, it is the main exercise in the AP World History exam, and the documents have to be short, and that's why teachers like short documents. Susan, if you can go to the next slide. So here's an example of a DBQ, and you can see the document length. You don't even have to really read it at this point. It's a good question for Indian Ocean scholars and for Gulf scholars, but you can see the documents. The first thing is the first part is the citation, and it's 2 or 3 short paragraphs at the most, and that's what teachers really would like to see more of. So thank you very much. Yeah, and there's always a visual document as well. So
Okay, so I'm going to talk mostly about resources, which is why I had intended to go last. But that's okay, and I actually whet my appetite to do this because of the things that Matthew was saying. So my part of the presentation is looking at state standards and sharing with you outreach resources for professional development. And I have put already in the chat the folder where this presentation is found, which has all of the live links that you need to follow along with what we're doing. So there is AP World History, but there's not only AP World History. Okay, so there are state standards across the country. It is quite common that, in fact, it is almost universal that every state has some form of world history, often in grades 9 and 10, sometimes a 2-part course, meaning a draped course that does, ancient to medieval and then medieval to modern history across 10th and 11th, 9th and 10th grade. That's what we have in Virginia. It's more common that it's somewhere else. It might be at 6th grade or 7th grade, or there are courses which I have seen that have Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, that includes some kind of history and is followed up then by a world history course in some configuration in other states. So we have done a study of the Middle East in state standards on a website called the Middle East Pedagogy Initiative, and you see here the link at the bottom. It's just very simple, mesp.org, and we have created a secondary schools module there, and you can find quite a number of resources. It's actually is that compendium that Matthew was talking about of major resources that are out there. But what state standards do is basically to set the parameters of what is likely to be taught. Even if it isn't state standards but isn't tested, it may not be taught. So, and it's also a very packed and very varied. Some states have quite specific ones. Some states have quite prescriptive ones, and some states are really quite vague and just kind of scattershot saying, yeah, well, here's an inquiry arc, and here are some of the things you might do that come out in their standards saying. And even if the parameters are narrow and prescriptive, there are ways around them on any given region, like the Middle East and North Africa. My favorite bumper sticker is standards are a floor, not a ceiling. They are supposed to be a baseline. And if we are able to add some furniture and hang some drapes and paint a nice mural on the ceiling, we're doing very well. There's also some choice there involved. And some states, again, have quite extensive high stakes testing for courses, course by course, like we do in Virginia, and some states do not. So that would give you actually much more latitude. What we can do is to realize that one of the major ways through and around state standards, whether they're of high quality or not, is that skills standards across the country are really quite uniform, and they are considered to be paramount. That the reason we teach social studies is because we need to, create students who have skills for career and civic life and academic pursuing their academic concerns. So this include the use of maps, primary sources, and the use particularly of multiple perspectives on issues, not the least of which is recognizing bias. And realizing that this is a skill in every single state that lists skills, it has these kinds of skills. So this is very important also for holding officials' feet to the fire, if you will, in public hearings when standards are under revision. And we're currently involved in like 3 of those at the very present moment. So how to plot what is taught about a given subject. It's pretty strenuous to go through all 50 state standards, but it's been done several times. And so we can plot what is taught in really from ancient history all the way to the present concerning the Middle East and North Africa on this database of standards. It is a bit in need of updating because every state revises about every 5 to 7 years. And so there are some that are already in revision or have been in revision. This is an example of the document. It is actually listed in a Google Drive as a, it's shown right there as a database. And so you can, yes?
I'm not sure if you mean to be, but you're not sharing anything right now.
I'm glad you've told me that because I thought I was sharing all this time. Okay, thank you. I guess I was worrying about what happened to your share. Okay, thank you for that. I'm glad you did step up. Okay, so this is going back to show you here again is the link to the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative right here, and the state standards on the MENA is also there. Again, if you just go to MESPI and look for the secondary education module, you'll find it. So this is an image of the actual diagram. It's listed by state in the left-hand side, by the state website, and then the actual content that is mandated by each state standard is there. It's pretty daunting, but it's also quite useful to get an overview. Middle East Outreach Council had done such a study some years ago, and this is now an update to the current, and we're actually working on updating it for those states that we know have also engaged in revision. It's also searchable, of course, because it is a database. Okay. All right, so where in the curriculum does Middle East and North Africa appear, or where can it be inserted? This is useful for in light of what Nora presented. So in K-12, you have kind of in general community studies, family studies, holidays and celebrations, and picture books support these topics. I will soon be mentioning also the World Area Book Awards that includes the Middle East Outreach Council Book Awards every year, and we have a full list of those for the past, going back the past, I think, 20 years. And many of the books that were mentioned are there. And I remember, Salt Houses is definitely one of the award winners at the time. So picture books is one of the categories. Then there's also nonfiction, and there's also then youth fiction. So in grades 3 through 5, generally you have civic standards on tolerance and diversity, again, holidays and celebrations, issues of identity, and then literature, nonfiction, and fiction that supports these kind of topics. Depending on, you know, the interest of the teachers. Social studies itself, like science, takes a back seat in elementary education to reading and math. That's quite unfortunate because they can very well be integrated with at least definitely literature. In 6 through 8 is where the content really gets stepped up, where it's much more likely to find systematic content. Eastern Hemisphere, World Studies and Geography courses in grades 6 through 7, where the emphasis on culture is somewhat problematic and somewhat stereotyped. And the regions, unfortunately, follow sort of Cold War develop, you know, third world, first world, second world kind of stuff that is a carryover from, you know, what should long be obsolete, but unfortunately still is not. And in quite a number of states have added these geography-based courses as the students' introduction to the world as a whole. 9 through 12, you have, of course, world history courses, regular and AP, advanced placement, from ancient to modern, and teaching about world religions is quite a standard topic there. Usually the major 5 are taught, but the guidelines for teaching about religion have been fairly well absorbed into the standards process, whereas they weren't before. And if anybody wants to ask me about those, I can talk about that in the Q&A, but there's no time to do that kind of now. World geography is also a topic in 9 through 12, including an AP human geography course. And then, of course, in US history and US foreign policy studies, often brings up issues about the Middle East. That actually might be the place in the whole K through 12 curriculum where the most of coverage about the Israeli-Palestine issue actually shows up. Probably quite short as well, but maybe not as short as it would be in a quick running world history class. And then US government, AP government, we've been having a series called TIPS that has been organized for advanced placement comparative government with panels of scholars on the 6 countries that are covered in the comparative government course in AP. It's really quite stimulating. So here is the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative Resource Guide. And there you will find, as I mentioned, the standards, but you will also find categories of an entire resource guide, which has literally hundreds of resources, some of which are the kinds of things that Matthew was asking for in his presentation. I can just highlight a couple of those. It includes, this includes free downloads, complete curriculum guides, teaching units, films, and literature, topical guides that focus on sound approaches and emphasize skill acquisition. We have a project called Rethinking the Region. That was a British Council, Social Science Research Council effort called teachmena.org. We have a wonderful website by the National Endowment for the Humanities and American Library Association, Bridging Cultures /muslimjourneys.org, contains 25 books with related resources and also some films. Another project that has self-contained lessons that one can take pieces from, which do include primary source documents, Our Shared Past in the Mediterranean. World History for Us All is a really good resource that is based around primary sources, the lessons that go through kind of the transition to the eras model rather than the civilization by civilization model. And there are several resources, again, to be downloaded here. You can have this presentation, so I'm not going to dwell on each and every resource. This is the combined presentation we do every year with Howard University at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and Georgetown University. We combine with the Children's Africana Book Awards to highlight books and authors every single year. There is another initiative, however, that again, all of these book awards list their books that have been vetted, and this is the World Area Book Awards, and you can see here the links to it, where you will find a list of books going back probably to year 2000 from all of the 5 awards on all the world regions. So those of you who teach world history, who teach world geography courses of one kind or another, area studies courses, will find books that have been vetted for indigenous authors, indigenous illustrators, wherever possible, and in general have really identified some good materials. This has led actually to the National Resource Centers, like we are, National Resource Center at Georgetown on the Middle East and North Africa, has engendered the beginning of a Teachers Book Award, book club, that's run out of the University of Minnesota Center. And we're probably going to expand it next year. So these are some things that you can count on. I believe we've come to the end here. Yeah, so that's good. And if I have your presentation in the meantime in
You should. I shared it
email,
with you.
I will then load it up. So thank you very much. And again, I invite you to take a look at these resources that are there. I'm going to stop sharing and pull that down. And perhaps you can just begin by introducing yourself, Virginia,
Yeah,
and
so
while I get that up.
apologies for the technical issues. My name is Virginia. I teach 9th and 10th graders at an independent school in Northern Virginia. And I have a background in Middle East studies and international studies, both in undergrad and in grad school. And so my topic, my presentation is looking at kind of baseline best practices for teaching Middle East studies, in particular looking at younger grades, so 9th and 10th graders, and looking at on-level world history classes, so not AP, not electives, and focusing on there. And it looks like Susan's got my presentation. Thank you so much, Susan.
You're welcome.
So you can go ahead and click. So this is based on my experiences. It's not a comprehensive look at all the various techniques, right? I'm constantly learning new techniques as a teacher, as I'm sure the other teachers on here can attest. And so this is kind of, I like to think of it as a working document. It's qualitative, not quantitative. And based on students who have little to no prior knowledge of Middle East history. Next slide, please. So this is the order of my topics. So you can go ahead and do the next one, Susan. So prior knowledge, it's really going to depend on the communities the kids have grown up in. If students have personal connections with someone who either identifies with one of the many identities associated with the Middle East, or potentially has parents that come from the region, grandparents, if somebody is Muslim or Jewish, right, then you will get that. But really having that personal connection makes a big difference. If they don't have that, just because of where they live and who they're interacting with, there tends to be less prior knowledge. Overall, two main concepts students associated with the phrase Middle East are Islam and terrorism, but as a stereotype, which has not always been the case. So I think as a stereotype is important to emphasize. They understand that there are stereotypes surrounding terrorism and talking about the Middle East. They don't necessarily always understand why that stereotype exists, and don't necessarily know how to unpack it. Next slide, please. So geography, talking about the origins of the term Middle East, right? And this is something broadly the discipline is looking at as well. Okay, east of where, right? Thinking about what countries are included when we refer to the Middle East. Often, just a quick Google search, you will get maps that look different. Some maps include Sudan, some include all of North Africa, some include Afghanistan, some don't. And so that can be confusing for students, especially if they don't have that prior knowledge. So it's important to go over geography, in particular because students need to understand how countries are located in relation to each other in order to understand some of the history and the events that occur. Next slide, please. So origins of Islam is another important focal point, going over kind of basic things such as the Prophet Muhammad, who was he, right? Going over the 5 pillars, going over the Sunni Shia split, which definitely most students, even if they've heard of Islam, have not heard of Sunni versus Shia. And so going over that's important to really flesh out their understanding of Islam as a religion. Going over the Quran and the Hadith. And then really important, I think, is to go over the geographic and temporal relationship that Islam has to Judaism and Christianity, right? And really emphasizing that there's overlap here, and there's a lot of things that these 3 religions have in common, both in terms of the religious beliefs, but also in terms of the shared history of the 3 religions. Next slide, please. Okay, vocabulary and pronunciation. So a lot of students, when trying to discuss topics related to the Middle East, did not know which term to use. They did not understand the difference between Arab, Muslim, Islam, right? And so just giving them that knowledge and kind of setting a expectation that it's important that they know how to refer to people who practice Islam properly, right? It's a form of respect, and it's an important piece of knowledge. Tied to that is pronunciation. So frequently students, when they can't pronounce a word, they will either skip the word entirely, or they will kind of trail off as they try to sound it out, or they'll exaggerate the sounds into something that's not actually even close to what it's spelled like, but it's they get nervous, they get embarrassed, and so that's what they do. But again, right, pronunciation and correct pronunciation's an important, 1, piece of knowledge, but 2, indication of respect, right? We don't want people to mispronounce our names. Same goes when we're talking about historic names, right, and places. So the way I've worked through this is by scaffolding. So providing students with phonetic pronunciation next to the original spelling so that they better are able to pronounce the words. Setting expectations early that this is something that's important. It might seem silly, it might seem like a small detail, but really kind of holding that standard and emphasizing again the respect issue. And they really seem to understand that, especially once I frame it in terms of, you don't like it when people mispronounce your name, right? And so there's no reason why we shouldn't be extending the same courtesy when we're looking at historic places and people. Next slide, please. Thank you. Identifying student misconceptions. So in the time that we're teaching Middle East studies, we're in a post 9/11 and just absolutely inundated with social media. And so because of those 2 things, as relates to Middle East studies, there's an increased likelihood that students are going to have negative misconceptions. Not necessarily as much as we were seeing, I would say, in like 2010 era, but they are still out there. And so I usually take the first lesson to help identify misconceptions. Part of the way that students are going to be comfortable with this discussion is if class norms are set, and making sure that students feel comfortable sharing, being vulnerable and sharing that, oh yeah, I had a misconception. I didn't know that, right? And being respectful of each other when discussing that kind of thing. And so that's an important starting point to really keep the class at a positive level and a way for the students to continue to learn, right, without getting into the emotions of, you're discriminatory, you're racist, that kind of thing. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Well-rounded curriculum. So this is related to stereotypes, right? Talking, especially, Nora was referring, right, to the various types of stereotypes we see with the exotic, right, being one of them. That is something that I often see coming up in the beginning of this class. And so having well-rounded curriculum helps with that, right? Making sure students aren't getting the impression that the Middle East is only a place where there's war, for example, right? But making sure to focus. Obviously, war and conflict do play a role when you're talking about Middle Eastern history, but also focusing on culture, on politics, economics, architecture, art, all of those various components. In addition, it's important to look at the Middle East as its own entity, not just as it relates to the European powers. So talking about it, the Ottoman Empire as its own empire, not just as it relates to World War I, right? Along with the different topics, also looking at different time periods. So, I mean, with any region of the world, there's going to be a rise and fall as far as how powerful that region is, how positively or negatively things are going. And so making sure to have that that variety is, again, key for making sure there's not a negative stereotype or image being associated with the Middle East. And then finally, geographic diversity, right? When we say the Middle East, it's a handy phrase to refer to a certain region of the world, but making sure students understand that there are vastly different cultures and histories and people within that region. And again, this is going to help dispel stereotypes that students have. Next slide, please. Ensuring student support, right? So this is really key when you're teaching a class that includes students who identify with one or more, right, of the many identities that we see in the Middle East. In particular, you want to make sure that students aren't seen as spokespeople, right? So aren't being put on the spot to speak for all Palestinian immigrants, right? For all Muslim students, right? That kind of thing. So making sure that teachers aren't doing cold calls, that there's correct pronunciation, addressing stereotypes, and giving students choice, right? Some students really are passionate about talking about parts of their identity, right? Others are not. And so making sure that they have the ability to choose how much they want to discuss and kind of be put on the spot. And then the second part of student support is in the context of simulation and debates, making sure there is intentional framing so that students understand background and making sure the topic selection is appropriate, right? There are some things that are just not appropriate for simulations and debates. You know, one that comes to mind, you know, looking at who's correct, Israel or Palestine, right? As far as, you know, who should get the land, right? That's just not going to be something that students are equipped to get into and is going to cause more harm than good if presented in a debate or simulation format. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, there's definitely more ideas out there. This is about continued feedback and discussion between teachers, but also really between teachers at the secondary level and Middle East studies professionals at the post-secondary level, and really working together. Other things that are critical for teachers to do is to make sure they're following current events. Students almost always are going to be more interested if they can connect what they're learning in history to the reality they see in the world around them. And then finally, being willing to make mistakes, right? Most teachers are not Middle East studies experts. And so, however, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be teaching it. And so being willing to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes is important as well. Thank you so much, Susan.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing and take questions. We had lost a little bit of time with our technical glitches today, thanks to Zoom, which is otherwise our lifesaver for the past numerous years. So we'll forgive the people over at Zoom. But anyway, I'd like to turn it over to Kristen, who will moderate the question and answer.
So if anyone has questions, please go ahead, or if you'd rather write it in the chat, that's also fine.
Right. If you want to just use the hand raise function that we'll be able to see, and it will also line you up in sequence of who asked what.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this, all of you. I actually have a question for you, Susan. When you went through the standards, was that before the AP powers that be decided to start the world history in the Renaissance?
The state standards are not related to the College Board's guidelines for advanced placement world history. Those are two different things. The advanced placement course is separate from and extra, but every state has a program in any case, so that students might take what you might call regular kid world history, either 1 or 2 years, depending on where they are. Like say California has a 3-year program actually, 7th grade and 8th grade and excuse me, 6th grade ancient history, medieval history, roughly to the Enlightenment is 7th grade, and then modern history in 9th or 10th. Virginia has a 2-year program, 9th and 10th grade. Some schools or some states or districts have initiated something they call pre-AP, which solves that problem or attempts to. When the College Board decided to cut it off at the Renaissance, they were going to do it even worse than that, but but they got pushed back to at least include, you know, some of the run up to 1500 and so on, and that they're calling pre-AP. So it's a double course, and the College Board insists that yeah, they were actually trying to encourage dividing the world history course for the reasons that Matthew so skillfully showed us, divided into 2, but that's going to be costly for you know, schools and or students who would have to pay for 2 of them. So there are different ways that it's doing it, but the state standards are something different. That is the K through 12 program for social studies and all the other subjects as well.
Right, but I've been looking at a number of them as well, and I noticed that a lot of them only have ancient history in 6th grade. Is that what you've noticed is seen as well?
It's one way of doing what has been recommended since the late 80s, which is to drape the courses chronologically. Also, US history is draped so that they might have the you know, early up to, I don't know, Reconstruction or something like that in 5th grade, and then in 8th grade they go further, and then they repeat the whole thing in 11th grade. In world history, similarly, they might have a course that's 6th grade, 7th grade, and 10th grade, or again 6th grade ancient history, and then some combination. But in general, across the states, there are multiple years of world history in the secondary curriculum, meaning from 6th grade up.
Right, but how much do they retain from 6th grade relative to how much they retain from 9th or 10th grade? Sorry, I'm coming at this. I'm actually my training is actually in archaeology, so I have a bias in this area.
Well, it depends on the professional development, of which content development is usually not something that districts unfortunately much do. That's what we National Resource Centers are here for, to provide that content.
Right.
And we willingly do, and thanks for the, you know, Title VI program, which is actually funding this, you know, as National Resource Centers, we can provide that for teachers. And we've been lately very well connected so that we're sharing our content and our programs with each other. That was not so much the case before COVID. But to answer your question, it really depends on how well it was done. The California 3-year program is actually quite well structured. But at least the 2-year programs that are adjacent to one another would seem to offer a better chance. What I think is the least constructive are these Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere geography-based courses that try to do history at the same time as contemporary geography. And generally, you know, it's horribly hard for teachers, and it just kind of makes a mess because you don't do either one well. And then this is often followed then in high school by a modern world history course, which I think is really, you know, dooms them from the start in terms of getting the necessary background. And then you sort of look at the contemporary world, and it ends up with a fairly stereotyped view of who's up and who's down, you know, what developed countries industrialized versus not. And it you know, it can come bouncing back to be culture. But I could talk all night on that, and I won't.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
There's 2 questions in the chat. One from Karen about if there's been efforts to collaborate or pen pal with schools in Israel, Palestine, which sort of sounds like a question for Nora, except she's not in the classroom, so I don't know who wants to take that one. And a question from Jay about which countries are considered to be in the MENA region, which is a great question that I always play with my students on the first day of class.
I can
also.
answer that one really quickly because there is a really nice slideshow at the UNC Duke Consortium on the Middle East, which is called Where is the Middle East? And it shows how that term originated, and it gives you an actual amazing, shift in maps. Just a little hint, the Middle East used to mean South Asia. The Near East was what we call now the Middle East. And of course, the Far East, we all know where that is, right? Very, very interesting. And especially when you look at whose Middle East, strategic military planners, economic, religious, very interesting configurations. To the other question, does anyone know about these exchange programs? I do think there are some out there that might be found. Global nomads, I'm thinking there's classroom exchanges that happen not just between those two, but many other countries.
Yeah, I can say that I know that sectarian, so the religious denominations do sorts of pen pal connection programs, to my knowledge. I know certainly Jewish communities do a lot of pen pal work, but they only do it most of the time with the Jewish Israelis. And I imagine that mosque as education is doing something similar with Palestinians, but I don't know for sure. Susan might know that a lot better than I would.
I wouldn't say mosque schools because Islamic schools are a whole different animal. They're not always affiliated with mosques, and they're often, accredited just as any other private school. They do all sorts of exchanges.
Well, both the day school equivalents that you're talking about, and
Mhm.
I don't most mosques have some sort of educational Sunday school equivalent.
Yeah, they have weekend schools, sure, but
Yeah,
I don't know if they do those sorts of exchanges. They do a lot of interfaith, but that's a different thing than classroom exchanges using different platforms. There was a program, I cannot think of what it is right now, but they did a panel at the First Amendment Center at one time. But I mean, if you do a search, you'll probably find those kinds of programs that do classroom exchanges from one region
Yeah.
of the world to another.
We do have classroom exchanges between teachers and classes in the US and classes across the Middle East and North Africa. And depending on who applies, that may or may not include Palestinians and Israelis. So the first 2 years it included both Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs. This year, no one applied from within the Green Line of Israel, but there is a teacher from Ramallah whose classes are involved in it.
I see Rana MC has put a link in the chat. Any other questions?
Just I have just a comment, like from hearing all of your presentation are amazing, but as a Palestinian growing up in Palestine, I feel with the conflict and what Nora was talking about, how I raised my kids, how she raised her kids learning about Palestine. But I have a comment I live there and I lived here, and it seems from presentation you're talking about Islam and Israeli, like it's the conflict, you're trying to show the conflict is between religion. It's not the conflict there in Palestine between the religion, it's conflict of ownership of the land. Who's the original people of the land? Who are they kicked out of their land? Who are the people who were offensive to the people who are living in their original land? So the problem is between Palestinian and Israeli. It's not a religion problem. It's a problem about the land, just to clarify this comment. And also, like, there is the Middle East, it's not just the Islam in the Middle East, and the Christian culture, it's a huge in the Middle East. And there is a different culture through all over the Middle East, and a lot of immigrants, they came here in the United States, and especially in Michigan. We have big community here in Michigan. They have their own churches, they have their own schools. Like, they have really good impact on the people in Michigan who's living here. Thank you again.
Scholars, Yvonne Haddad has written wonderful work on the Christian Arab churches in the United States and the work that they do.
Matt, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, just one comment about to Jay's point about where is the Middle East, just as a to put on my academic hat as a Persian Arab Gulf historian. I mean, if you look at the Gulf in history, and historically it was more tied to the Indian Ocean than to the Arab world, although the people who lived on the Arab side of the Gulf spoke Arabic and dialects thereof as their native language. And then it was really in the 50s and 60s and 70s when that part of the world became more oriented toward, well, Cairo and Beirut and Damascus and Baghdad. So even a single, a location or a sub-region might change. We can, if we want to think of it in relation to larger regions, like it can change with time. So to play off what Susan was saying, I mean, yeah, the Middle East is a construct that changes with place and time and who's creating, who's defining it as the Middle East. There was actually a book that just came out called Creating the Middle East, which is about the history of British imperial perceptions of the Gulf states. I also had a question though for Kristen and Virginia, and one thing that we haven't talked about is parents, and what I have at Brooklyn Tech, and we have a lot of immigrant parents, from who work very hard, and when it comes to school and teachers, they don't want to rock the boat. So we don't get a lot of questions about what we teach, which is nice in one regard. And sometimes I'd like to have more questions about what I teach. But what have you gotten any pushback from parents and administrators in teaching about the Middle East in your electives?
So I will say I have not, in my experience. So I taught previously in Memphis for 2 years, and there was some pushback when a quote from the Quran was used in like a school assembly, much in the way that a Bible quote was also used, and so that's where I was seeing pushback, but not in the classroom per se. Now that being said, that was just my experience, but my observations have tended to be that there's more pushback if there's mention outside of the classroom versus inside the classroom.
Yeah, I have to say I've never had any negative feedback about it. If anything, parents are usually very happy that kids are getting exposure to subject matter that they wouldn't normally have access to in the classroom. So if anything, even parents whose kids aren't taking the class are usually happy that it's getting offered and that there's that opportunity to take a different curriculum and different courses.
That's good to hear.
But just of course to say that it's different when you bring Palestine in, that there are all kinds of attacks and problems and challenges when teachers bring Palestine into the classroom, and that relates to the issue of the conflation of Judaism with Zionism, in that sometimes sadly, not just individual parents, but groups are acting on a revised definition of anti-Semitism that includes critique of Israel. It's called the International Holocaust Alliance, Remembrance Alliance, IHRA definition. It's a redefinition of anti-Semitism away from Jew hatred to include criticism of Israel. And this is affecting the teaching of Palestine, and it's affecting Palestinian teachers, regardless of what they're teaching. Recently, a Palestinian teacher was fired, who's a phys ed teacher. And I know a physics teacher who was also fired for bringing Palestine into the classroom. So it is an issue that we have to work on together as an educational community to make sure that students have access to the information that they need to be constructive global citizens, and just to be knowledgeable and educated and informed. And the chilling effect of this kind of conflation is anti-educational, my point of view.
I just wanted to build on the couple of comments that came out, and that is the one that when we have in the classroom maps that show a vast area in one period or another as being, say, in the case of Islam, green, and this is a kind of conflation as well, because it erases or it hides the diversity within those lands, whether it's an empire that is diverse, or in particular the region that is called the Muslim world is actually ethnically, religiously, linguistically, and every other possible way diverse, and has been so since the outset. And yet that big green blob across, the middle of Afro-Eurasia is very deceptive, and students, tend to do it. They tend to fall into that trap. And if we don't directly draw their attention to it and bring out some specific examples of the religious diversity that prevailed over these many centuries, they will miss that. So I think we have come to the end of our time, and we really appreciate your having stuck with us all this time. Thank you so much to the panelists. And again, we are being able to bring this because of our grant from the U.S. Department of Education that funds a National Resource Center at Georgetown University and shares outreach between the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. So I thank you. And again, you have in the chat the link. And if for some reason you lost the link to the resources and the presentations we provided today, then just drop me a line and I will reproduce that Google Drive link, which should be accessible to everybody. So thank you so much, and wish you a pleasant evening and a